When you ask a Nightlords fan why they love this legion, chances are they'll mention the Nightlords trilogy by Aaron Dembski. This is the same guy who wrote Hell's Reach, which is another book that turned fans into die-hard Black Templar apologists. After reading both, I get it. These books are incredible, and if you haven't read them before, or in my case listened to them, you're really missing out. Throughout the book, the remnants of the Legion cling to memories of a supposed golden age when they wielded power, glory, and fear across the galaxy. Their monstrous actions are fueled by their hatred for the Imperium and the belief that the galaxy betrayed them. Talos, our main protagonist, is consumed by bitterness towards his warband, the galaxy, and even the Legion for losing everything they once had. But that Legion never existed to begin with. Now, that is a bold statement, I get it, but when you examine the history of the Nightlords from their inception to their current state, it becomes clear that their legacy is nothing compared to the nobility of the Ultramarines, the strategic brilliance of the Iron Warriors, or the technological mastery of the Iron Hands. The Nightlords were never conquerors. They were the Emperor's attack dogs, sent to quell unrest among civilian populations through fear and brutality, going from essentially a penal battalion to executioners of civilians. After the Ultramarine assault on Sagwalsa, the Legion shattered into warbands, each comprised of only a handful of Marines, barely enough to fill a single Space Marine company. There is no glory in such history, no tales of heroic conquest. The Nightlords were a marauding band of criminals, murderers, and monsters from the beginning. The Horus Heresy and descent into chaos worship did not represent a fall from grace, it merely exposed what was already a sick and dying Legion. Beneath the sprawling hive cities of ancient Terra lay vast underground prisons, hidden within endless networks of caverns where sunlight never reached. The men and women condemned to these shadowy depths were sentenced to a life without hope, denied even the polluted air of the surface. These prisoners were ruled by anarchy. There were no wardens, no laws, only chaos, where a loaf of bread could cost you your life. In this perpetual darkness, generations lived and died. Children born into these cavernous halls were raised amidst violence and despair, knowing nothing of the world above. These children of the night, hardened by their grim environment, became the first recruits for the Emperor of Mankind's 8th Legion. During the Emperor's unification of Terra, he established laws that would later shape the Great Crusade, laws banning religion, regulating psychic powers, and outlawing forbidden gene manipulation. While many warlords bent the knee and swore fealty to the Emperor, others defied him, breaking these laws or openly rebelling. When such defiance arose, the 8th Legion was unleashed, delivering swift and merciless retribution. When the 8th Legion descended on a population, there were no trials to prove innocence or guilt, no degrees of guilt, simply innocent or guilty. Once deployed to a region, the verdict had already been decided. Guilt was absolute and punishment was annihilation. The warriors of the 8th Legion were created as monsters to put down other monsters, to fight the darkness for a future of light. But what sort of bright future could the 8th Legion live in? Were the 8th Legion simply a necessary evil? Monsters needed to drag a dark age into the light? Perhaps they were a simple mistake by the Emperor, who was desperate for manpower during the Unification Wars. The 8th Legion was damned from the beginning, being used as a tool to create a future they were not welcomed in. We cannot discuss Konrad Curze, Primarch of the 8th Legion, without first discussing his homeworld, Nostromo. Nostromo was one of many planets that made up the human empire before the Age of Strife, an industrial planet whose smoke and smog blocked out the faded light of Nostromo's dying star. For every man, woman, and child on Nostromo, the best life could offer was long, grueling work at one of the many industrial centers sprawling through Nostromo's 5 major hive cities. The population lived in abject poverty. While a few wealthy elites lived in luxury, corruption was rampant, from the top of society to the gang-ran streets below. Criminal gangs ruled the slums of Nostromo, with every inch of smog-blackened alleyways fought over by rival gangs. Murder was the currency of Nostromo. Unlike his brother Primarchs, Curze was never adopted by a human family, rather lived entirely alone and survived by hunting the feral animals of Nostromo Quintus, the largest hive city in Nostromo. Curze took it upon himself to bring order to this lawless planet, and within a year, crime rates dropped to essentially zero, and the people of Nostromo Quintus self-imposed a curfew, staying out no later than early evening. And by restore order, I don't mean he organized a police force within the city. Rather, he restored order through random brutal murders of anyone that broke the law in his eyes. Through sheer brutality and random killings, Curze became the planet's dictator, assuming the title of Dark King of Nostromo. Konrad Curze was united with his father, the Emperor of Mankind, on 896 M30, nearly 100 years after the Great Crusade began. Curze assumed leadership of the 8th Legion and renamed them to the Nightlords. And while effective in many forms of warfare, Curze preferred fighting with overwhelming odds against their enemies. He encouraged his legion to paint and decorate their armor with iconography, bones, and flayed skin to instill fear in their enemies. He taught his legion to bring peace through unspeakable violence. On planets like Lestrantia 4, offers of surrender were just outright rejected, and the Nightlords descended on a population that was already willing to be compliant. Skinning pits were created, and entire cities were crucified. Not out of necessity, but because they seemed to just enjoy it. When Konrad departed from Nostromo, the fragile order he imposed collapsed. The gangs and criminal syndicates that once ruled the streets quickly regained control. No longer were promising young men sent to the 8th Legion as recruits. Instead, the ranks of the Nightlords were replenished with the dregs of Nostroman society, petty criminals, gang enforcers, and back alley killers. Talos, one of the remnants of the Legion, describes the shift as the poisoning of the Legion, a moment when the Nightlords truly lost their way. Yet this perspective ignores a harsh truth. The Legion was already poisoned from the start. Talos even acknowledges the monster that he has always been throughout the book, despite being part of the Legion from the very beginning. He was not one of these petty criminals that poisoned the Legion, yet he acted just like them. Konrad Curze not only tolerated but actively endorsed the atrocities committed by this Legion against defenseless populations. Worse still, the Imperium itself, and perhaps even the Emperor of Mankind, turned a blind eye on these actions, if not outright encouraged them. The 8th Legion was a blight from its inception, created to spread fear and terror as tools of compliance. The recruitment of gangsters and murderers didn't corrupt the Legion, it merely revealed its true nature. Now this is the part of the video where I would go over the Great Crusade and the death of Curze himself, but honestly, I just don't care. I just wanted to point out that the Nightlords weren't some kind of noble anti-heroes, but have always been monsters since the very beginning. On places like Reddit, where only the most productive conversations take place, I always see people misunderstanding the Nightlords as a whole. They see the Nightlords as some anti-chaos worshipping necessary evil the Imperium needed, and no. And as far as chaos worshipping is concerned, Talos is a very delusional character, yearning for a past glory that just didn't exist, and raging having to use chaos on their war against the Imperium. And people who read the Nightlords trilogy tend to think everybody in the Nightlords Legion thinks just like Talos. But just looking at his immediate allies tells you otherwise. 2 of his squad members worship Slaanesh and Khorne. His warband's captain is possessed by a Tzeentch demon, and he utilizes the bleeding eyes, which are warped talons that just kind of eat people. It doesn't look very anti-chaos to me. Maybe you could argue that sometime during the Great Crusade they had this noble purpose, this past glory that they always speak about, but I find that having a legion that just rejects surrenders just so they can go onto a planet and create skinning pits isn't very necessary, but that's just one man's opinion. Let me know what you think down below, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this kind of content. Thanks for watching. You want to burn and skin people and crucify civilians and babies and children and women and sew their bones onto your body? Oh my goodness.